just wanted to say a little bit about our intertidal and coastal environment. I think it's something we risk taking a little bit for granted in Devon. We've got our two coastlines, north and south coastline, and these are some of the richest and most special environments that we have. But when you think about the estuarine environments that we're going to be learning more about this evening, we've actually got 12 estuaries in Devon. That's put into context when we only have 90 in the whole of the UK. So we have a significant proportion of the estuarine environments that we have across the whole of the country. And these are really unique and really special, and depending on where you are. So in North Devon, we have the Tortoise Estuary. That's got the highest tidal range that we have of any estuary environment in the county. It provides really important protection for wildlife from the Atlantic coast. So those huge westerlies and gales that we have blowing in, they do a huge number of coastal processes that they help support, but that feeds whole ecosystems and a whole diverse range of wildlife which is found in that area, right in the heart of the biosphere reserve that we have up in the north. But then as you travel round to the south, where the majority of our estuaries are, they are quite a lot more sheltered, and everyone is special and different. If you go out from the Hoe at Plymouth and you're into the Tamar estuaries, you can only perhaps go a few meters out from the coast. You could be in eelgrass beds, there could be cuttlefish, seahorses. You even got very rare fish that move through that tidal and intertidal environment as well, with the Alice shad. So you go around east, we actually have a really significant proportion of these flooded valley systems, which we call RIAs. So places like Salcombe and the estuaries in that area, really sheltered, super special for a whole raft of different wildlife there. The range of reef habitats that we have is really special. As you travel east, you're into some of the more rocky shore areas and rocky environments around the Dart. Even further east, the Tean, which I think is a real unsung hero of all of our estuaries, and onto the Exe. I mean, those intertidal mud and sand environments provide such a bounty for hundreds of thousands of wintering wading birds and water birds. Really special. And we travel east to the East Devon estuaries with the otter, sid, and axe. Again, absolute engine rooms of the environment. I often am looking on the internet and looking on Facebook, and I often see comments about, well, what good's mud? What's good these intertidal environments? And I'm led to believe a meter squared of our intertidal mud can have up to 10 million microscopic worms, thousands of snails. You know, these are real driving engine room of our ecosystems. They're the real heart of life in that coastal intertidal environment. But they haven't always been recognized as being so special. Historically, they've been claimed from the sea. We've put tidal and flood defenses in. They've been heavily engineered. Even in some circumstances, we've dumped refuse and waste. These were places to treat badly, really. But now we recognize just how critical they are for wildlife, but for us ourselves in terms of the benefits from carbon sequestration, which are huge, the flood risk benefits, but also from a recreation side of things, our health and well-being is benefited so significantly from being in and around these environments and seeing that wealth of wildlife. So hopefully I've done some credit and our coastal intertidal environments there, focusing on marine, on estuarine environments. I want to now hand over to Dr. Lydia Burgess-Gamble. So Lydia's the Senior Project Manager for the Promoting Adaptation to Changing Coasts project. She's been with the Environment Agency, I believe, for about the last 20 years, and has been pioneering a lot of work around natural flood management. So that's focusing on harnessing nature's power to be able to protect and mitigate us against flood risk. So yeah, over to you, Lydia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I will just share my slides. Bear with me 2 minutes. I'll just get my slides up on the screen. Right. Well, thank you ever so much for inviting us to come and talk tonight. It's a real pleasure to come and talk about our Promoting Adaptation to Changing Coasts projects. And I'm going to start off by talking a bit about natural approaches to climate change impacts. And then I'm going to move on to give you an overview of our EU-funded Promoting Adaptation to Changing Coasts projects before I hand over to Mike and Sam, who are going to provide more detail about the Lower Otter Restoration Project. So we find ourselves in a climate emergency, and as Pete has just talked about, our estuaries and our coasts are very precious places, but they're really impacted by the effects of rising seas and a warming climate. The science is now kind of undisputable that climate change exists and it's affecting us. This diagram by Professor Ed Hawkins at the University of Reading uses 170 vertical colour bars to show how the climate has changed progressively, heating our planet. And we now find ourselves in the red zone on the right-hand side of this slide. Even every day throughout the year, I think we can all say that the months and the seasons are changing, and it feels warmer in February than it ordinarily ought to do. Climate change has quite negative impacts for us as a human species. The UK average temperature has increased by 0.8 degrees between 1961 and 1990. Over 5.2 million homes and businesses are at risk of flooding. We're seeing increased levels of precipitation in the winter. And the UK has seen 16 centimetres of sea level rise since 1990. And sea level rise will increase throughout the century. We're also starting to see more drought conditions in the summer. Since I've been working at the Environment Agency, when I joined in 2003, we started to see a lot more increases in places impacted by flooding. In 2007, there was really severe impacts that affected the whole country, with a massive impact, not only on the communities who are devastated by flooding, but impacts to the economy. Since then, we've seen really substantial flooding in Somerset. We've seen coastal erosion on the east coast. Really devastating impacts of Storm Desmond up in Cumbria. There's some really severe flooding in Yorkshire. And then almost every year we see smaller floods that impact all of our communities around the country. However, back in 2007, after the 2007 floods, we started to see a shift in how flooding was managed. In the past, flooding was managed by building flood walls, building ever higher concrete flood walls. But after the 2007 floods, there was a fundamental review of what had gone wrong and what could be done better. It was called a Pitt review. And Sir Michael Pitt has really changed the way in which flooding is managed in our country, because he talked about the need to not just build walls to protect people from flooding, but also the importance of working with nature to help protect people from the impacts of flooding. So he talked about working with natural processes to restore the natural processes within coasts, estuaries and rivers, so that these naturally functioning habitats could help to store water and help protect communities from the impacts of flooding. So now we don't just talk about walls. When we talk about flooding, we talk about a whole range of different approaches, from restoring nature, from engineered structures that you might see in your own community, through to temporary defences, like I know you have in Exmouth, to temporary flood barriers on homes and emergency evacuation plans. So it's a real toolbox of different approaches that are needed to manage flooding as we go forward in the future. Following the 2007 floods, the government funded some pilot projects to trial natural approaches to flood management. There was a site over in Somerset called Holneycott, which was a Holneycott estate where they used natural approaches to flood management to try and protect the community downstream. There's a project in Pickering up in Yorkshire, which used trees and wooden barriers to work with the local community to protect them from flooding. And then there was a moorland restoration project in the Peak District. And these three pilots, called the Making Space for Water pilots, have been really important because they've changed our environmental policy. And we now have the 25-year environment plan, which really places quite a great emphasis on working with nature to improve the environment, not just from a flooding perspective, but to improve water quality, to provide habitat, and also to enhance our own human well-being. And this is also now reflected in our own National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy, which has a wide focus, but also emphasises the importance of protecting and restoring nature. Working with nature is really important to help us adapt to the impacts of climate change. But we're not just in a climate emergency, we're also in a nature emergency where we see loss of habitat globally, fragmentation of habitat. And what's really important is that responding to the climate emergency in a positive way by restoring and creating habitats also has a win there. It helps us deal with the nature emergency, providing space for wildlife. And I have seen previously mentioned that sometimes people think that when we restore nature, we're caring more about wildlife than we are people. But actually, by restoring nature, we're helping protect ourselves as humans, as well as wildlife. So it's a win-win for the environment, for people. So what does natural approaches to flood management look like? Well, it's really varied. In Devon, you've had lots of projects on Exmoor and Dartmoor in your uplands, which have restored the moorland environment to hold back water. I'm really sorry, my cat has now joined us, but bear with me just 2 seconds while I'm just going to.
That's absolutely fine. We'll just hang fire as a cat is being extracted. I've locked my dog out from this evening for just that problem, because it usually comes in with a squeaky toy. So
sorry,
don't worry at all, Lydia. Thank you.
I knew that would happen. There's a sixth sense for me talking. So natural approaches to flood management are really varied. There can be upland measures like restoring the peatland. Now my presentation seems to have stalled itself. Here we go. It could be woody dams across a slope and a hillside. It could involve planting trees, restoring watercourses, and restoring a peatland. Then as you go down your catchment, there are other measures which you might be familiar with, like river restoration, floodplain restoration, planting trees within floodplains, and offline storage areas like you have in Exmouth, which capture and hold water, but also provide a resource within the local community. And then finally, as you get down to the coast, which is our focus today, you can see different measures like managed realignment, which is where pulling back flood defences from the coast and creating salt marsh and mudflat habitat, or restoring and protecting sand dune areas, which provides protection to the community inland, or the use of beach material to protect your beaches from erosion. The natural approaches to flood management are really, really varied, but what they do is they help slow, store, and filter water, and that in turn helps protect us from the impacts of climate change, but also creates habitat for wildlife. They also help buffer against the impacts of climate change where we'll see more stormy conditions on the coast. Sort of rough salt marsh habitat helps to sort of dampen down the impacts of waves. So much like humans, we're encouraged to have 5 a day and to make sure we get our vitamins in. Restoring natural processes within a catchment helps ensure that our rivers and estuaries are healthy and helps protect us inland from the impacts of climate change, but also provides invaluable habitat for the important species that live within our communities. Promoting Adaptation to a Changing Coast project is a really exciting project, and you'll know potentially of it through the Lower Otter Restoration Project, but it's part of a larger project. So the Promoting Adaptations to a Changing Coast project is a project that's funded by the European Union to a tune of €26 million. Half of that money goes to us in the UK and half of that goes to our partners in France. And it's helping guide pre-emptive adaptation to climate change. It's recognising common issues between ourselves and our partners in France. It's focused on estuaries and coasts, and through developing real-life salt marsh restoration projects. We're hoping to learn a lot and share that throughout the project with many of the other estuaries that were mentioned during the introduction. The project started in January 2020 and it ends in March 2023. It involves a multitude of partners. In England, there's ourselves, the Environment Agency, we're what's known as the lead partner. DEFRA, our government department, is involved, and the East Devon Pebble Beds Heath Conservation Trust and the Clinton Devon Estates are really key partners because we're working with them on their land, but also on delivering many of the project outputs. Our partners over in France are based in Normandy, and they include the Conservatoire du Littoral, which is a bit like the National Trust or Natural England. And then they're working with their local community in a town called Beavers and with their local council. So here's where the projects are based. We've got the Lower Otter in East Devon and the Saône Valley over in Normandy near Dieppe. And they're two estuaries, but they're really united by really similar problems. So they're almost twinned in terms of the sort of issues that they're addressing. Both the Lower Otter and in the Saône Valley have suffered from flood risk issues. There was a near miss several years ago, which Mike will talk about, where one of the embankments on the Lower Otter started to fail. We've had similar issues over in Beavers in France. There's also been a recognition over in France that to building flood defences and making bigger concrete walls isn't going to protect their community from flooding. And they've really got to do a range of different approaches to help protect that community from the impacts of climate change. And that involves working with nature. In a similar vein to ourselves in the Lower Otter, the cricket club on the Lower Otter has faced flooding, but over in Normandy, they have a campsite which regularly floods. And as part of their project, they'll be moving their campsite to higher ground because it's a really important resource to their community. And as you might be aware, but I'm sure Mike and Mike will cover this a bit later, we're relocating the cricket club as part of the Lower Otter Restoration Project. So there's another similarity. Both projects are also recreating intertidal habitat, restoring salt marsh. So we're really united in our similarities despite being divided by the channel. The project has got 3 main components to it. The first part is the construction works, which are happening on both sides of the channels, involving the restoration of the habitats. Another similarity between our 2 sites is that as part of the Lower Otter Restoration Project, the sewer main will be diverted, but over in France, they're creating a new sewage treatment works. The second part of our project We'll also look at the socioeconomics and people's views around restoration of habitats. And we'll also be doing something called a natural capital assessment, which is where we look at what the site looks like now, what habitat might be there, how much carbon that site's capturing, what its flood risk management benefits are now, and then compare that afterwards once the site is restored to understand what change has happened. And then finally, we'll be pulling together everything we've learned into a how-to guide, which we will be sharing widely so that others can benefit from the learning from our project. And then finally, before I hand over to Mike and then to Sam, is to say there's a lot of information on our Promoting Adaptation to a Changing Coast website, but also this Lower Otter Restoration Project, which is a really invaluable local resource to find out more about the project. And also it's a place where you can get questions answered. So I'll hand over to you, Pete, and apologies for the cat. He slightly distracted my train of thought.
Don't worry at all. It's always good to have animals on the screen as well. Ideal. But thank you very much, Lydia. That was fantastic. I would like to just remind everyone to pop any questions that they have in the chat, please, so that I can log those and ask them later of our panel. What Lydia introduced was, I suppose, a really great policy and funding environment that we're in now, that actually things have shifted. There's been this seismic shift in terms of how we're looking at the natural environment, and moving away from those conventional ways of considering flood and flood risk to really embracing nature and making sure that we're putting natural systems in and restoring natural processes wherever possible. It isn't going to work all over the place, but in many situations, nature's there and can assist us. The reason really why we're where we are now is because of people like our next speaker. Mike Williams has been flood and coastal risk management advisor for the Environment Agency. I look here, he started with the NRA, if anyone can remember the days of the NRA back in 1990, and has been really they're championing the role and ensuring nature and biodiversity are really integrated into all of Environment Agency's work, and especially the flood risk management aspects. We've worked really closely with Mike over many years. I mean, I started in the industry in the mid-90s and knew Mike from then. We've been in Devon, trying our best for some time now. But yeah, there's been some tremendous work that Mike has achieved, and one I think he'll hide his light under a bushel a little bit is in terms of regulated tidal exchange. I think Mike, you'll probably be talking to us a little bit about that maybe, but he's pioneered some really innovative ways of allowing tidal the flow of tides, the estuaries, to breathe without necessarily having to remove significant areas of flood defence. So it's a real pleasure to have Mike with us this evening, and over to you.
Thanks, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here. Good evening, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen for you. And come along. There we go. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about the Lower Otter Restoration Project, but I think you'll hear as we go through things that hark back to both what Pete said at the beginning and what Lydia's just said too. What you can see on this screen are a couple of slides showing the view now across the lower part of the Otter Valley, looking from the footpath that runs up the western side of the valley, across the cricket ground towards the iconic Scots Pines that are above the mouth of the Otter Estuary. The top picture shows it as it is now. The lower picture shows it as we expect to be in a few years' time. So the bit of background for you, and I'm sure some of you will know this, but it's probably worth saying for those of you who are perhaps not so local or don't know some of the history of the Otter Estuary. This slide shows a picture of a scanned version of the map produced in 1808 by James Green, who was the county surveyor for Devon. And I hope you can see it. It is difficult to see all the detail. It's a large plan, and obviously it's pretty reduced like this. But James Green produced this plan of a piece of mudland called the Runny for Lord Roll, who was a forebear of the present Clintons, and he owned a large part of the lower valley. And what you can see on this map is that all of the lower valley of the Otter was estuary. It was nothing like it is now. You may be able to see the river snaking its way down through there and emerging at the mouth of the estuary behind the shingle bar, which developed in the mid-16th century. But what it shows is mudflat and sand and salt marsh all the way, basically a long way up the valley, almost indeed to Otterton. And of course, if we went back sufficiently far into prehistory, then it would indeed be very different. So what happened as a result of James Green's proposal to Lord Roll? And this is the then area, roughly, of intertidal habitats, so those mudflats and salt marsh. But what happened in the early 1800s was that an embankment was built. There is a red line on this map, and I've just enlarged it so that you can see it more clearly here. But that is the line of the embankment, which was built all the way from the back of the shingle bar right up to where Little Bank is now, for those of you who know it. And indeed, that's the upper end of the Lower Otter Restoration Project. So at a stroke, that embankment allowed all of that former mudflat and salt marsh to be converted into agricultural land. Fairly low-grade agricultural land, it has to be said, suitable really only for grazing cattle, no crop production on this one. But it did make a very significant change. And the Otter is by no means unique in this. If you think about the other estuaries, particularly in South Devon, but it's also true on the Tortoise in North Devon, there are large areas of flat land behind embankments that were largely captured from estuaries and turned into agricultural land. This was a time when engineers could do and would have a go at doing most things if somebody would pay for them to do it, without a great deal of consideration about the environmental impact of what they were doing. So the embankment was built in around 1814, and that meant that we have this arrangement now. So there's that same embankment, and what I've done is twiddle an ordnance survey plan, and you can see that actually the shape of the embankment as planned by James Green is very, very similar to the embankments that exist today. And those embankments, we have this plan, the original of this plan, exists in the estate's archive. It's a fantastic resource, and it's not alone. There are other supporting documents that show how the banks were built and all of the other plans. One of the things that didn't happen was that a canal which was proposed for the rear of the marshes never actually was constructed. But the embankment was, and it turned all of those fields, or all of those marshes rather, behind the embankment into agricultural fields, leaving just that bit of estuary. So we've only got about a third, between a quarter and a third of what original intertidal habitat existed. And that's part of the reason why the otter is so very different today. When we restore the flooding to the Otter Estuary, we'll increase the tidal prism. That's the volume of water that flows in and out on a tide by about 2.5 times. Because that volume has been so much reduced over the last 200 years, what we see today in that blue triangle is really a rather modified estuary. It doesn't have the extensive mudflats that it should have. It goes from muddy creeks very quickly into upper salt marsh and salt marsh grassland without the intermediate and lower salt marsh that you would expect. So there is a very long history East Budley, yep. Poolhays Farm. South Farm is the other tenanted farm over to the east of the valley. Okay, keep going, Pete. So there's Otterton Mill. There's Little Bank, created in 1814, which extended all the way. Mr. Cockram at Poolhays Farm, next slide, complained that his land was wetter, so they improved it and built Big Bank to reduce the problems. Next, please. Obviously, the railway was constructed down the valley on an embankment running down to East Budley. And the next, and a cricket club in the early 1930s. Next one. Whitebridge, or the road across the valley floor, and Whitebridge was constructed, and the Budley Brook, instead of meandering across the valley floor, was put into an aqueduct that leads it from the outside across into the Otter, but without proper ecological connection. And then we have an old tip, which was in operation from 1928 to 1978. It was Budley's Halterton Urban District Council domestic refuse site. Thank you. So, the Lower Otter has been very heavily modified. You can see that with the sum of all of those. And it seemed to us that the sensible thing to do, given the consequences of climate change and sea level rise, and the likelihood that those embankments that were created in the early 19th century will fail at some point. And it is better for us to manage that process and put in place a way of dealing with that expected failure, rather than just allowing it to happen accidentally. As some of you will know, in 2018, we very nearly lost the whole of the site overnight when the embankment down by the cricket club failed over a period of only about 48 hours. So we started to plan the Lower Otter Restoration Project, which many of you will have come across over the last few years. And I just want to run through the major parts of what it is that we're doing as part of that project. We're going to create a 70-meter breach in the estuary embankment down by the back of the cricket club. It's number 7, if you can see that on your screens, down in the southeastern corner. That embankment carries the Southwest Coast Path. 250,000 people a year walk up that coast path. And so we will reconnect that or ensure that the connection is maintained by creating a footbridge behind the breach. Breaching the embankment will allow us to create about 55 hectares of intertidal habitat. And that's the pale yellow stuff on this slide on the map on your left. As well as breaching the estuary embankment, we're going to lower sections of both Little Bank and Big Bank down to floodplain level, because the other consequence of the creation of the embankment was to cut the River Otter off from its floodplain. So the Lower Otter now from Little Bank, where it runs close to the river, down to certainly down to the White Bridge, which is really the end of the sort of riverine section, no longer has any significant floodplain left. It doesn't even carry the mean annual flood. So by lowering sections of those two embankments, will allow the Otter to reconnect to its floodplain. And as soon as the Otter starts to flood into the floodplain, that water will be able to run down the valley. But unlike now, where when it overtops the embankments and fills up the valley and being retained behind the embankments, it'll be able to escape out of the bottom. So in order to facilitate that, we're creating this tidal creek network, and you can see the grey creek which runs all the way up through the middle of the site, which allows the tide to come in and the tide to go out again, so that at low tide, what we will see is exposed mudflats, much more characteristic of most of our estuaries. We're also taking the opportunity to renaturalize the Budleigh Brook. So the aqueduct will be demolished and the Budleigh Brook will be returned into the valley floor in the floodplain. It'll turn first north and then east and join into the tidal creek. So there'll be a much greater level of ecological continuity from the sea and the Otter into the Budleigh Brook, which used to be an extremely good trout stream. Where South Farm Road runs across the valley floor, it would flood on every high tide if we were not to do something about it. And so we are raising it onto an embankment, raising it some 2.5 meters for the whole of the length of the road from White Bridge across to South Farm cottages. And that will put it in a flood-free position so that it can be used into the future. Southwest Water have a pipe that runs from their pumping station in Limekilns car park to a combined sewer overflow into the sea just on the eastern side of Otter Head. And that pipe runs along the back of the shingle bar, which of course is part of the Jurassic Coast World Heritage Site. To avoid having to protect it in situ, we're going to move that pipe. It's going to be drilled, directionally drilled under the estuary, reconnected to the existing outfall. And that will provide a real win for the estuary going forward. It'll provide it with new infrastructure in a much better location. As Lydia said earlier, the cricket club is being relocated to a flood-free site. Yes, Budleigh Salterton Cricket Club has a wonderful site, very scenic and historic. But unfortunately, it really isn't sustainable there. And indeed, it's been so wet that in previous seasons, it's actually impacted on the ability of the club to play there. And then finally, in terms of the major parts of work that we're doing, we're protecting the old landfill site, which was not well finished. It wasn't well capped. The capping will be improved. A small section of the old landfill site will be removed at the western end in order for us to create the new tidal creek and the new road bridge. But the site will be protected from erosion and should be secured into the future, which would not have been the case if we were to have awaited some kind of accidental breach of the embankment. Next slide, please, Peter. Thank you. I know that one of the concerns of lots of people has been our preparation for doing the works on the Lower Otter. And one of the most obvious impacts has been what we've done in terms of clearing vegetation from the whole of the site in advance of carrying out some of the other works, and certainly in advance of breaching the embankment. And I just wanted to say a few words about why we are doing that. We've removed trees and other vegetation essentially from locations where if the embankment were to fail accidentally, salt water would kill those trees and that vegetation. It's proved a very unpopular thing in other locations to leave trees on site. This picture is showing a site called Cwm Ivy on the Gower in South Wales, which I visited last summer. But I first heard about this probably 20 years ago, looking at sites on the Humber, where trees had been left and the tide had come in. And it was quite an emotive subject for local residents, because what they could see was the old landscape outlined in dead trees. But there are other really good ecological reasons for removing the trees before the site is flooded. Obviously, it's much harder to remove them once it is flooded. But in addition, trees and hedge lines, if they're left in situ, tend to trap debris, whether that's man-made debris or natural debris. And because they're in the middle of an intertidal area, they're very hard to clear. And then in terms of the wildlife that we're hoping to attract to the site, Sam will say a lot more about that. Waders in particular like to be able to see what is going on around them. They don't like their sight lines interrupted, and it can actually deter them from using areas, as well as potentially attracting predatory species. We know, for example, on Exminster marshes, that there are issues around both corvids and raptors using dead trees as perches, and again causing issues with use by wildfowl and waders. So I'm going to stop there and talk about and pass over to Sam, who I hope will talk about some of the really good stuff that we're expecting to see as part of the project.
Thanks very much, Mike, and well done for coping so well with the gremlins. So we've had a cat in the first one and a gremlin in the second, and soon Sam will see what he's got to navigate past. But I think your presentation might excellent, but it just shows how complicated and complex intertidal habitat restoration work can be. They're places that we love to visit. But they also support so many livelihoods, and they give people a real sense of place. They're areas that we really relate to. So change can be really difficult. But then you add all of that other additional factors in, like infrastructure, roads. Why did people put a refuse tip in an intertidal area? There's more than one of those in Devon. Yeah, it's so challenging, but it shows if you have that vision, ambition, and the science and evidence behind you, and with the right policy shifts and the right funding environment, amazing things can be achieved. So yeah, I'll hand over to Sam now. Sam is the Head of Wildlife and Conservation for Clinton Devon Estates. DWT and Clinton Devon have worked very closely, especially since Sam has worked with the estate. He's got a tremendous history in terms of his science and evidence work. Having worked with the Natural History Museum and the Royal Botanical Garden, and we work very closely together in their work on the Pebblebed Heaths, 1,000 hectares of now National Nature Reserve, which is largely in Clinton Devon Estates safe hands and ownership and management, alongside Devon Wildlife Trust and RSPB. But Sam's also been instrumental in his involvement with the Devon Beaver project, or the River Otter Beaver trial. So welcome, Sam, into your next step in your career with the Lower Otter Restoration Project.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Pete, and thank you, Mike and Lydia, before that. And I was going to share my screen. Here we go. I don't have any gremlins, hopefully, or cats, but I do have a couple of children roaming around that might appear. So I am going to talk about some of the great things that I think we will attract into the estuary in terms of habitats and wildlife, but I'm also going to hopefully give an honest appraisal, because of course when you do schemes like this there are also some losses, and you have to be aware of what those are. I like this slide because it kind of gives you an indication of what we've got at the moment. So on the left hand side you have the existing, or the last bit of the remaining estuary, and it's salt marsh there. And you've got the embankment snaking up the middle with this sort of black thorn scrub. And then to the right is the pastoral, sort of agricultural landscape that has developed over the last couple of 100 years. Now, the otter is not as celebrated really as the kind of, say, the Exe or the Axe valleys, and partly because the wildlife isn't thought to be so tremendous. But actually it has quite a lot of wildlife nevertheless. It has a broad mosaic of habitats. You have the salt marsh and mudflat, you have some reed beds, you do have some bits of scrub on the old tip, for example, and these things all support species of various kinds. So in the reed bed, for example, you might expect there to be sedge warblers, and there are indeed sedge warblers and reed warblers. On the old tip with a scrub, you'll have Chetty's warblers and blackcaps and whitethroats and so on. But the main kind of habitat we're focusing on today is this salt marsh and mudflat. So this is the remnant area that we have, and it's probably known most for the way that it attracts many wading birds, particularly in the sort of autumn months. And these are some of the species that we currently find actually on the estuary. So I won't read them out, they're there for you to see. So they do arrive, things like avocets, more kind of irregularly, but not in massive numbers, to be honest. And ideally there'll be far more. And if we were to support far more of these birds, we would have a much greater area of mudflat and salt marsh. So one of the things, there are many reasons why salt marsh and mudflat is so valuable. Of course, it is a rare habitat. We've lost a good 80% of what we originally would have had around our coasts, and every year of that remains, we're losing a further 2% because of rising sea levels. One of the reasons why they are so important is they're incredibly important for supporting fish species and providing nursery grounds and as refuges for fish fry. So species, so these slides here, sorry about the quality, but they're actually taken on the Otter Estuary. So one part of what we're doing is to really monitor what we've got and how that changes over time. So in the autumn, in September, we went out into the creeks and we looked at the fish that we have, and the most common species was goby, and then bass there in the top right, and also grey mullet, thin-lipped grey mullet. And these species this intertidal habitat is very important for them, and indeed for bass, it is the most important nursery ground that we can have. So by extending our areas of intertidal habitat, we will be supporting a range of fish species, things like flatfish and plaice and dab and so on. Flounder, you'd expect to have in estuaries. We didn't, maybe not on the otter, but certainly elsewhere they would thrive there. I really liked Pete's his little kind of bit of information about the millions of creatures that are living in a square meter of mud, and I had to get the reference from him afterwards. But there's three things here that you will probably see, and more visible to the eye, I suppose, on the otter. One is the furrow shell there in the top left, and the ragworm and the mud shrimp. And I guess the point of this slide is just to show that we don't always like mud, and we don't always think it's important, but it really, really is. It's thriving and teeming with life. And of course, where you have these invertebrates that are in the mud, it brings in the wading birds that will follow. So brent geese here, you've got a curlew and a godwit. But of course, since this area, most of the area has been reclaimed and drained for agriculture. Other habitats have developed around the edges of the productive land, bits of bramble or sort of hedgerow lines along sort of the edge of drainage ditches. And of course, habitat species have moved in to occupy that, more terrestrial species. I would say here that the hedgerows are not probably hedgerows as we would think of them, these thick, very species-rich Devon banks. These are kind of scattered lines of willow, mostly associated with drainage ditches. And of course, the otter site, it is agricultural, but it also has a number of quite interesting plant communities, and it is a county wildlife site, the Otter Meadows, and this is one of my favourite pictures of the site. And indeed, I'll be sad to see this habitat go, partly because the ragged robin is my favourite native species. And this will go when we make the breach. It will be flooded with seawater. And I want to frame everything that I talk about now, in that, you know, the sea is coming up this valley, whether we like it or not. This habitat will be lost here, but we hope and expect that it will kind of move and be kind of created further up the valley. But that is a loss. Quite often, people will be thinking about, well, what about the mammals, or what about the reptiles? And it's very rare, and that anybody will I'll get an email saying, what about the sedges? And actually, some of the most important things we have in this valley are the two sedges. Actually, there's a species called the divided sedge, and there's another one called the gallingale. And divided sedge is nationally scarce. Not many. It's one of the only places in Devon that has it. And so if you go up the valley, you might see these posts with the red marks on it. These are areas which we've pinpointed the position of this species, and we'll take great pain to translocate them to other sites so it's not lost. I just say this because I think it is important to recognise that there are losses as well as some gains, but there is a process in which you can kind of minimise that. So these are some of the creatures that you would expect to have moved into that kind of farm landscape where it's not, you know, around the edges. So dormice, you would expect them to be dormice in sort of thickets where, you know, which are rich in brambles. You'd expect there to be harvest mice in some of the reed beds and the tussocky grasses like the cocksfoot. You'd expect bats to be kind of commuting over the top of the hedge lines. You also would well expect them to be maybe roosting in some of the older trees, which has sort of flaky bark and little kind of crevices and nooks, and some reptiles here, such as the slow worm. And indeed, all these species do occur in the Lower Otter Valley. I want to show this site here, which is across, it's looking west to east across the tip. It was formerly a poplar plantation, and it's now sort of blackthorn scrub with some brambles. And there you have there's a whitethroat and a Chettis warbler there. And we have to be mindful. It's really important we are mindful of what's there and make sure that when we're doing the project, we're doing the best for these species. And of course, the river is most famous for its most recent arrivals, the beavers. And we also have otter, of course, and we have eel and trout and so on. And so these are all things we have to be aware of. So when we do this breach, this 70-meter breach that Mike mentioned, the sea will come in up the valley and a very long way up. And we'll be losing those sort of that 55 hectares, mostly of I would say fairly low value agricultural land, but some slightly richer habitats. And we'll be getting much more mud, and we'll be getting much more water. And having that mud and that intertidal habitat will support the range of species that I mentioned before. So it'd be rich in marine invertebrates, and it'd attract much bigger populations of wading birds. And this is the natural habitat for this valley. It is not the pastoral landscape. So it's important that you go through a process when kind of assessing the kind of positives and the negatives from doing projects like this in terms of wildlife. And for any that are interested, you can go onto our website, and I would encourage you to visit the LORC website. And if you dig down there, you know, our environmental statement is available, and is also kind of available for the planning process. And how you do this is very quickly is you do your ecological survey work. You draw on all the records that that are known for the site. Some of those are from local naturalists. Some will be held in the Devon Biodiversity Record Centre. Some indeed will be in the estate records, because we've been monitoring the wildlife on the estuary for a very long time. And you're looking at the wildlife features, the habitats that you have. You're assessing the importance of each of those habitats, whether it's nationally important or regionally or local or so on. And you're going to assess the impacts of this scheme. If we go ahead with it, what will we be gaining and what will be losing? And then you try and work out what mitigation you might need, what the residual effects are, and so on. And of course, when you're doing anything in this, it's important that you have your licenses right if you're going to be impacting on protected species, and that all the works you do are supported by very well-trained ecologists who are basically scrutinizing everything that's done. And I would say that all the work that you may have seen or may have witnessed over the last few months, there's always been ecologists there that have been doing fingertip searches of the vegetation before we've acted. And generally the principle has been to persuade the species that are there that we want out into the surrounding landscape by, if you're doing a clearance of something, you do it in sections, you're doing it towards the side of the valley rather than the other way, so they can escape out. You're not doing works in the bird breeding season, for example, or when and so you can minimize the work. And of course, before you come in with the machine, there's an ecologist there to check you're not disturbing anything. So this is a kind of summary really of what we are, I guess, put things in perspective of what we are gaining and what we're losing. So we are losing a little bit of woodland, just over 0.5 hectare. But of course, and it's right that we do that, we are going to be planting over 2 hectares of woodland in compensation for that's lost. We are losing 34 trees. It's not a huge amount, but it's still significant, and many people love these trees, and we'll be planting more. The hedgerows, and I'm going to come back to that. These aren't really hedgerows as we normally think of them. They are essentially lines of willow. We will be losing 2.5 kilometers of that, but we will be planting a 4.2, which will be species-rich hedgerows of mixed broadleaf species. But of course, that takes time to develop. We will be losing that grassland. But we will be gaining significant amounts of mudflat and salt marsh, and that is, and of all of those habitats, those are by far the most ecologically important, I would argue, and the most precious. And I think it's right that we're going in this direction. I think I'm going to finish with this. I think this is my last slide, but this just shows one of the trees we have lost is the black poplar on the left. Now, the black poplar is one of our various tree species, actually. So this one probably dates back 150 years. It's an interesting species because you have sort of both different male and female plants, and we only have mostly males in the Otter Valley, and there's some further up the valley, partly because when they were planted, people didn't like the kind of white fluff from the seed from the females. But this is a sort of tree where that is a tree that has features that you might expect bats to come in. And so this particular tree story, it was being climbed various times. We had static bat detectors in the holes to see what kind of bats might be there. When they were known to be absent, those holes would then be closed off to stop any bats from going in. So it was really carefully done. And before it was felled again, it was inspected. And that hedgerow on the right-hand side, that's an interesting one, actually, because a lot of when we're doing the hedgerow, we tend to do it to ground level, but actually because we're going into the hibernating season, it wasn't right to go right to ground, which is why that particular one's been left to 30 centimeters. So there's this kind of methodology around that, but I would say we've taken great pains to try and do the best for the wildlife that's there in preparation for the wildlife that's going to come. What's really nice is this, I think it's fair to say that this has been, many people have found this difficult. This is a much familiar, it's a beautiful landscape. It has its wildlife interests that I've shown, but actually, already we've dug the creek network. This is above South Farm Road. And you can always, in your mind's eye, see how this is going to look. And what was really nice is to have some good news story already. So before Christmas, we had the largest flock of European white-fronted geese arriving on site that's been seen in Devon for many, many decades. And that was kind of, was a really good thing and attracted a lot of interest. And since that time, we had some good numbers of glossy ibis as well. I'm conscious of time, and it's really important to get time for questions, and I can be happy to elaborate on these things. But thank you very much. But hopefully in 5-10 years' time, we're going to be seeing a lot more of these guys and the whole plethora of waders. And I really do hope and expect that the otter can be as magnificent as it once was 2 centuries ago. And if you consider it with the axe and the X and others, we have a really nice network of wetlands that can support these species. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Again, a fascinating presentation, and again, it just highlights the scale and complexity of making those sorts of changes, but doing it in a, you know, as in a responsible way, especially when it comes to the wildlife that's going to be impacted, but also that could return. And it's stunning to see white-fronted geese in those sorts of numbers back in the area. So I'm just going to invite now all of the speakers to put their cameras on, and thank you to everyone who has put questions down in the chat. I've done my best to jot those down. I think it will be difficult for me to look at that and multitask and add any more. So if there are any questions which are coming through later, we will take a note of those and pass those through to the team. But as they have said, there is the access through the web pages, and if there are any specific questions, I'd be really happy to help afterwards. But yes, I've got a few questions to start things off, and let's start with the funding and then the sort of partnership side, and then probably move on to the wildlife and biodiversity. One of the questions that came through very early on was a lot of worry about the EU funding side of things. You know, will we still get the EU funding? Is the money guaranteed into completion? And also, does the UK Treasury look to support these sorts of future schemes? I think this might be sort of Mike and Lydia's realm.
Yeah, I'll have a go, and then Mike, feel free to join in. So our project is fully funded through to March 2023. And yeah, so the project is definitely going to get those funds. In terms of future funding, I think we can be, in England, we can be a partner in EU funded projects, but we probably can't be a lead partner like we are in this project. For PACCo, we're the lead coordinator on both the sort of English and French side. So I think we can be a partner. I know there's a Horizon 2020 funding bid open at the moment to do with nature-based solutions, and Environment Agency has been encouraged to be a partner in that, but I'm not sure what exactly it looks like for other funding sources, whether Interreg is still open to us. I don't know if you have more information, Mike.
Only just that there are Interreg programs going on into the future in which the UK may be able to be involved. France Channel England program, it ends in 2023. That's not there's not a follow-on. There've been several of those, but there isn't going to be a follow-on for that particular program. But there are others which I believe are going forward, and I suspect it will still be worth looking at European funding programs to see whether there are opportunities. And of course, following Brexit and the changes that has made, the funding landscape is changing, and the UK government is going to have to think about how they cope with those changes. We don't know how that's going to happen yet, but there are other ways potentially of helping to pay for projects such as this. Difficult in Devon, but in other parts of the country where there is more development, for example, it's entirely possible that because works like the Lower Otter Restoration Project are targeted on sites where it is no longer appropriate to continue to maintain what were defences, allowing us to focus on those defences which are essential going forward to protect people's homes and their business properties from flooding. In areas where there is more business and more homes close to the coast than there are here, that may actually mean that we can draw in external funding, and certainly the Environment Agency is always seeking, as part of the projects that it carries out, to do that sort of thing. And I believe that where we are going to be creating improved defences in the future, it is highly likely, given the flood and coastal risk management strategy and policy documents that have relatively recently been produced, that actually, in order to do those improvements to defences, it is likely that we will be able to do habitat improvements on the back of them as well. There's much more pressure to do that now than there used to be. And I guess the other thing is, and Sam may wish to say something about this, in terms of public expenditure for public goods and the new environmental policies that are being produced by the government.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions to get through, Mike. So I'll move through quite quickly to so that we can make sure we can get to as many of those which have posed them as possible. I've sort of themed them a little bit, but those answers were great, and it's really reassuring that obviously we've got that funding for this project, and it's key that we are able to draw down for the next estuaries that there might be in the county. One I thought, but excellent question. What one person posed that there's been a real challenge in how we are able to reveal scientifically that nature-based solutions work, and that can often be quite difficult. Allied to that is how are you actually monitoring the benefits? So we've talked about some of the challenges at the start, but how are we monitoring the outcomes? Yeah, one for Sam now, I think.
So I think it is a really good question, because quite often monitoring is one of these things that kind of drops off the bottom of projects, and you really want to know, is it delivering what it said it would on the tin? So we've already started the process. So part of that is getting your baseline data right. So we know exactly what habitats we've got here. That's why we did the baseline of for fish in the autumn, and we can monitor over time how those numbers and the species might increase. Likewise with carbon. I mean, I think Lydia touched on that, is that they are really, really important carbon storage areas. So we've already done, we're working with Manchester University to understand the carbon storage at the moment was stored on site in the agricultural landscapes, and we'll be doing that over time into the future. To understand that, we will need to be doing bird monitoring. So the birds that we expect are going to come, do they arrive? And you can do that through existing mechanisms like the Webb's counts done by BTO, and we'll also be doing, using citizen science to do that as well, and also looking at and how they may be disturbed. We'll be looking at, another really important part is looking at the socioeconomic value. So getting a baseline about, how do people like the valley now? What's the economic sort of output at the moment? What's the health and well-being value? And we'll be going back to monitor that over time. So that monitoring is absolutely essential, and it will be going well into the future. So when the project finishes on March 23, in essence, it's only just the start. We fully recognise that, and it needs to be well resourced.
And I'll just add a tiny thing, that actually this EU funding is what enables us to do that monitoring, because often it can be really hard to fund. And the sorts of information that we've collected on the Lower Otter is also replicated in France, so that we can share what we learn and they can share what they learn, which is something that wouldn't normally happen on a managed realignment project.
You're muted, Pete.
Dear me, sorry. First time for tonight. Yeah, I was just saying that foundation of knowledge and how critical that is, that baseline, but also that the future change. allied to that actually is how is this project going to be used to inform other projects? Yeah, how are you going to share that knowledge and experience with other places? One was very specifically focused around the appraisal process, that sort of cost benefit analysis that the Environment Agency has to go through. Is that
one of our work packages is all about sharing what we find and developing this thing that we're calling the how-to guide. So we're collecting all of our learning from this project as we go, developing this how-to guide. And then the intention is to share that in 70 locations along the channel, both in northern France and on the channel, British side of the channel. So we can share what we learn with others, but connected back to the appraisal process. Kendall, who works in Sam's team, is working on the socioeconomics and the natural capital side of the project. And she's connected with our Environment Agency economists who develop our appraisal guide. So we're hoping that we can share what we learn with them because they're updating some of the environmental components of appraisal at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Lydia. Of our Wildlife Trust members, I'm sure that they're at a vast majority. We will get on to some biodiversity questions not too soon. One question that fascinated me actually, and I hadn't really thought about it, was around geomorphology. So you're initiating this big change, and Mike, you talked about 2.5 times the tidal prism. That's pretty mind-blowing. You've got 2.5 times the amount of water that is going to be moving through. One person said, are we going to get a new sea stack at the end of the Otter?
Shall I get this? It's another part of the monitoring process. There is already a very significant coastal monitoring program managed by the Environment Agency, carried out by Plymouth Coastal Observatory, with all sorts of techniques used, things like LiDAR, where you radar from a plane looking down, basically, to establish ground heights. And also transects taken across things like the shingle bar. So there's a lot of that going on. The modelling that has been done as part of the project shows that the mouth of the Otter is likely to both widen somewhat and also deepen. Another reason why it was really important to relocate. Things are going to be monitored very closely. And yes, we expect to see some change, but it's worth remembering that actually, if you look at that going back to that James Green map from 1808, actually the mouth of the estuary then is not significantly different to how it is now. And so we don't expect there to be vast change. There will be, the bar is already quite dynamic, and we do expect to see some changes there, and we will expect to see some modification of the habitats just inside the mouth of the estuary where the velocities are changing most.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Mike. It will be fascinating to see how that landscape, especially the shingle bar, potentially shifts. But yeah, these sometimes it's the models are so good, but you can find out when things, they're dynamic habitats, aren't they? Which will be fascinating to see. So just on to a few of the wildlife questions, one specifically around the mammals and reptiles. Were any of the mammals and reptiles translocated? Have you moved any of the animals out from the area?
So, do you go, Sam, if you like? Yeah, sure.
No, go ahead if you got that.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to say that as Sam referred to earlier, teams of ecologists working on site all through the vegetation clearance. A small number, very small number of reptiles were found and relocated, and we've got refugia for reptiles to put them in. One dormouse nest was moved according to the license that we have, which means that basically it's moved from an area up to 100 meters away, but that's all.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We have I think Oh, sorry, I thought Mike had paused then. We have a beavery question, obviously my favourite subject. But what sort of effects do you expect to have on the beavers with more saline water coming upstream?
Shall I start on this, Mike, and then Pete can add in as well, actually. So as you'll know, we have the beaver reintroduction has been one of the great success stories in British conservation of recent years, and at the moment we're probably up to, from having a number of less than 10, we've probably now got 12 plus family groups spread across the catchment, and they're expanding. So they're still in the building phase, the species, so still I guess vulnerable in that sense. So what will the project have on them? Not a lot, to be honest. I think we have to remember, this is a highly adaptable species, and sometimes we forget that. And yes, it will be, this at the lower part of the valley will become estuarine. Can beavers live in salt water? They can swim through it, certainly, but they need to come back to fresh water. But there is very, very large amount of catchment for them to explore and to occupy in the coming years. So I think the impact, I don't lose any sleep whatsoever about the long-term impacts of this particular scheme on the beavers, and they will move on when they need to move on. They are about still. We take great care in observing them, making sure they are happy enough, and they're very happy at the moment. But when it's time for a move on, they will do so. So I worry much more, to be honest, about my sedges.
Yeah, sedges are a bit of my favourite, but I'm keen on the beavers as well. But I think the key thing here is that they cannot survive within those intertidal habitats. As Sam says, they might be able to pop in, but they don't do very well. Eventually, that area will be intertidal. The really positive thing is that there is a lot of habitat around that area that they can move into, and I know the team are taking all precautions to make sure the beavers aren't directly impacted significantly now, and that they are able to move on, and there's other habitat in the area. What we have to think is that it is give the opportunities for the animals to move on and to occupy other habitat in the catchment. But you think of the catchment scale, we've got hundreds of kilometers of watercourse in the otter, and huge potential for them. They're building, the population's thriving, they're doing very well. And there will be these localized impacts on them, and we hope they'll move on and find some fresh water just upstream. But
if I can add
keeping a very close eye.
Can I add something else, Pete? Is I think, the beavers are in the river, that's great. But ideally, we kind of want the beavers to be in the river, but we also want them kind of in the more marginal habitats. And really what I do hope will happen over the coming decades is that we allow more space for beavers in some of the more heavily managed floodplain areas where they can occupy and they can do what they do and create their wetlands that can do some of this natural flood defense or management that Lydia mentioned. But that means we have to think slightly differently about how we manage certain parts of our landscape, and that's quite an exciting proposition, but we still have some way to go.
I think the most exciting aspect of this is about most of our watercourses that we have upstream are in these quite deeply incised channels. The Lower Otter project is actually losing some of this the floodplain grazing marsh. Beavers upstream will be creating that. And that comes with it a wealth of biodiversity, the flood risk benefits, etc. So as beavers move upstream, we hope with that will come the space for them to reconnect those water bodies with the floodplain. There's one very specific question here which I was fascinated by around the sea trout population, and whether the otter is quite well known for its sea trout population. Will this have any impact on them? Will it benefit them or disadvantage them?
We don't think it's going to have any significant impact. Certainly all the plans have been scrutinised by our colleagues in the fisheries team in the Environment Agency. I mean, almost everything as part of the project has been looked at by technical experts within the Environment Agency, not connected to the project, working in independent teams. Certainly, we carried out some surveys. It may be that we get migratory salmonids moving back into the Budleigh Brook as well. There is a chance, although I would say that the channel that runs through East Budleigh is not particularly conducive to migratory fish, but there will certainly be a much better connectivity between the Budleigh Brook and the rest of the system, and it shouldn't make any difference. We don't believe it's going to make any difference to the migratory fish that currently use the existing estuary and move on up the Otter.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
We don't think there'll be the olfactory clues that fish follow. We don't think they'll be significantly changed, and that fish will continue to follow them.
And probably just a fun. I think if our trout have anything to worry about, it's probably not this scheme. It's probably about how land is managed further up, and the obstacles on the stream, and the water quality and pollution and other things. That is the thing. The sedimentation from agricultural runoff. That is the thing that I think we should be focusing on with brown trout.
Okay, we're just coming up to, well, we're at 8:30 now. So there were a number of other questions around actually about people engagement and how people can visit the site, explore it. And I think we point people in touch with the to the website where the information in that area is posted. I'm going to be really mean just to finish off this, but just as the panel were relaxing, it's almost like an interview question, this one. But I would say, just in a sentence, what to you, what would success look and feel like? Sam, would you like to start? Shall I put you on the spot and then others?
Okay, success for me would be a new estuarine reserve that is nationally renowned for being in good kind of ecological condition, that is attracting vast numbers of wading birds, diverse numbers, and that is being enjoyed by thousands and thousands of people, you know, and that people cherish the site. That's.
Thanks, Sam. But would Mike or Lydia like to add to that, or put a different slant on?
May I? I agree, essentially. I would like to think that what we have planned will be delivered. And to enlarge on what Sam said, one of the key parts of the project, and we haven't really talked about it, is that access to people and the benefits that people will get from that access. We know that it's a really important thing for people. And I really hope that what we do in terms of delivery, which will include in making improvements to the footpath network around the site, will actually enable more people to enjoy more of the Lower Otter in the future.
Thank you, Mike. Lydia?
Yeah, I would just add a slightly different slant, but I like it to be an inspiration for other estuaries around the country, where we can share how complicated and hard it is to do habitat creation, but what benefits it can bring, and also to deliver it all on time so Mike can retire happy.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, all of our speakers this evening. I can see messages down the right-hand side here. For, everyone has been really positive, and thanking you all for all your expertise and time. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It was an excellent evening. And I'll just wrap up by saying I just can't wait to see how this evolves. Enabling natural processes on this sort of scale is why I've been involved in conservation. It's truly inspirational, and it's really hard. It's really difficult. And it's people like yourselves and a whole range of others that are enabling these things to happen. And it's really challenging. So thank you for all your time this evening, but thank you for everything you've done in terms of the coastal environment and that intertidal environment on the River Otter. Last but not least, thank you to Chloe and Jan, who have worked behind the scenes to make sure that tonight has been such a success. So thanks very much, everyone, and have an enjoyable rest of your evening. Cheerio.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.